here in the mountains of Utah, on the back side of, or the front side, depending on where you live, of Mount Timpanogos. It's a mountain that is very popular here in Utah. It's very well known. A lot of people come up here to hike it, ski. I'm right across the way from Sundance Ski Resort. It's just right over here. And I've always loved this perspective. Came up in here to try to photograph this. There was no clouds. There were some great clouds on the other side of the mountain, but this side is just kind of hazy. But I'm going to try to photograph this. And I'm going to talk to you today about shutter speed, about operating your camera in manual and using shutter speed and how shutter speed works. I'm right on the side of the road, so there's going to be some traffic coming by. There's just not many pullouts here and not many great views along here without being on the side of the road, so it kind of is what it is. Here comes a car right now. So shutter speed is extremely important for getting sharp photographs. If you're not on a tripod. If you're on a tripod, it can still be very important if there's a lot of wind blowing the trees and that, and you don't want those trees to be blurry. Today, it's quite still. It's just a very pretty still day. As I was saying, the clouds are all on the other side of the mountain. So my shutter speed today isn't as important as if the wind was blowing or I was photographing a moving object. So for this exposure, I've set my ISO at 100, my aperture at 11, and my shutter speed at 200. I've got the meter set right on 0, and I don't have exposure compensation or anything like that turned on. Good average meter reading. The histogram isn't bad at all. I could brighten it up just a little bit. I'm going to drop the shutter speed down to 1/25 of a second. And that looks a little bit better. The whites look like they're just on the verge of clipping, so I maybe could bump it up to 160. What I'm doing is keeping the aperture where I want it. I'm raising and lowering the shutter speed to get the exposure I want. This isn't the perfect conditions to photograph in. There's no great clouds. The sun is right over here behind a tree. I'm standing in the shade of this big fir tree. I'm using that so I don't get lens flare. And this mountain scene is just spectacular, but the lighting conditions aren't perfect. I do like how I've composed this with these trees on the edge. I can see some telephone lines and a culvert that comes out from underneath the road. You know, that stuff I can Photoshop out. This shot is really about the mountain and how high it is and just beautiful with this bottom, this ravine bottom where the road comes up through with all these fir trees covered in snow. As you learn to shoot in manual mode and you learn what your camera and lenses can do, you'll find that your lens is probably as sharpest at one certain aperture. This one is really very sharp at f11 to 16, so I'm shooting this at f11. That means I have to adjust the shutter speed accordingly, and now I've got it set at 1/60th of a second. As I was saying, if you're photographing and the wind is blowing a lot and you want the trees to be frozen in the wind so they're not blurry, you're going to have to bump your shutter speed up quite a bit, up to 500, maybe even 1,000th of a second. To compensate for that in the exposure, you're going to either have to open the f-stop up wider or bump up your ISO. Just the way it is. If the f-stop, the depth of field, isn't as important, then that's perfectly fine to open your lens up. When I say open your lens up, I mean by making the aperture bigger on it. So that's one of the things you have to think about when you're composing your photograph and getting ready to take the picture is the wind blowing? Is stuff going to be blurry? Do you need to have the shutter speed set fast enough to stop it from blurring, or does it not matter? Sometimes you can just use a lower shutter speed and have all those trees and everything be blurry to show motion. Motion is very important sometimes in photography. A photograph is a one-dimensional picture of a three-dimensional object, and so it doesn't always translate over extremely well unless you're able to do things to get the depth and the motion into it. A waterfall is a classic example. Doing a freeze frame on a waterfall, with the high shutter speed will just freeze the water and you won't see any motion. Whereas doing a longer shutter speed on a waterfall, like a 30th of a second or a 15th or even a second or more, will make the water blurry and cause that motion effect, which helps translate in that one-dimensional image as motion. Another great example is a hummingbird. If you photograph a hummingbird at a feeder or flying and you use a really fast shutter speed, 4,000th of a second, you can freeze the wings right in flight. But if you use a slower shutter speed and just nail it right, you can see the motion of the wings without them being too blurred, and it shows that the bird is in flight. In one of my previous episodes where I talked about photographing in manual mode, I'll put that right up here, I show an example of some wild Mustang horses running where I used a slow shutter speed and panned along with them, showing the motion of them as they were running, which I think turned out beautifully. So oftentimes it's really important in a photograph to have some motion to bring the photograph alive. So I think I'm going to take you next to a waterfall to show you the examples of fast shutter speed and slow shutter speed. All right, now it's really cold. It's like maybe 18 degrees. This is Bridal. Oh man, that sunset's looking freaking amazing. This is Bridal Veil Falls behind me. It's in Provo Canyon in Utah. It's really one of the premier waterfalls in the West, I think. It's just short of going over to the Columbia River Gorge. It's an amazing waterfall. I'm gonna show you how to photograph it here. The trick to photographing waterfalls is using a slower shutter speed. You don't want to go too slow. You don't want the water to look too blurry. You want it to have a nice smoothness, but also some texture to it. So it's kind of a matter of timing the shutter speed with how fast the water's flowing and allowing it to have some blur. That's kind of hard to explain. Well, let me show you here what I'm going to get. Here's what I just got. It's a little bit blue. I've just got the white balance set on daylight. There's my histogram. You're going to end up with two spikes because you got some light and dark in there. I'm shooting this at f14 at ISO 100 and 1/3 of a second. Let's zoom in on this right here on the camera and inspect what I got. I'm going to go into about 100% and then look up the waterfall here, and you can see the water has that glassy look to it, kind of a spun glass look, but it's got some detail also. Let me really crank it up. I'm going to raise my ISO up a bunch to where I can freeze the water in motion. So now I set my ISO to 800, which I'm not a fan of doing, but I'm doing this for purpose. And my f-stop's still at 8, and I'm at 1/40th of a second. So as I zoom in here and look at the detail, you can really see a difference. You can see the texture of the water now and how you can actually almost see the water droplets. But for a real world application where I want a good photograph, I'm going to change my aperture back to 11 because this lens is pretty sharp at 11. I've got to then change the shutter speed down to get a better exposure. You can see the meter changing, and I'm going to put it where it says it should be, and that water has a nice blur to it, maybe a little too blurry, but I like that. It gives it a nice soft look. So I'm shooting this with my 28-70 2.8 lens. I'm going to put on my 70-200 so I can get closer to the waterfall. All right, that was with my with my 70-200, and that's at almost 200. And I really like that. That's a much better composition than what I was getting. If I zoom in on that, you can see the water is nice and glassy, just that spun glass look. I like that. I don't think that's too much. Learning to control your exposure settings by shooting in manual really is what makes the difference between a good photographer and a great photographer. Being able to control the situation and get what you want by changing the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO will really improve your photographs. In these instances, showing how to change the shutter speed to get the effect you want really can make a difference. There's quite a few great examples of being able to control the shutter speed to get really artistic photographs. One of them is known as ICM, or intentional camera movement. By using a slower shutter speed and moving the camera while you're taking the photograph, you can get some fantastic artistic results. For instance, this one that I took on a beach in Oregon was just really a fun night. Typically I do this handheld or with it on a tripod, and then by using the panning feature on the tripod pan. Another example you'll see frequently are fall leaves, forests in the fall, where you move the camera during the exposure to get these wonderful artistic abstract photographs. That's a classic example of why you want to learn to use a slower shutter speed so that you can get these artistic photographs. Well, the sun is set, it's starting to get dark, and I've got to hike back to my car. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this explained shutter speed and how you need to learn to use it. If you've got any questions, don't be afraid to ask in the comment section or contact me. You can contact me through my website. It's twmitchell.com, and I hope to hear from you. So I like to say at the end of my videos, because I'm really a cowboy at heart, happy trails.